Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 12th of November of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the border between the Zaporizhzhia direction and the South Donetsk direction, where the Russians opened another front line and began full-scale offensive operation in the direction of the road 0510. At least this was stated by the pro-Ukrainian mappers Deep State. And according to them, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions on the line between the villages of Piryutina and the village of Novodarivka. As for this situation, the Russians managed to take under control the eastern line, and currently the distance between possible Russian edge positions and the first buildings on the territory of the settlement is already less than 800 meters, which means that most likely this upcoming night between the 12th of November and the 13th of November, the Russians will try to make first attempts to answer the territory of the settlement. Usually the Russians prefer to attack during the night period of time because they have more chances to finish assault operations successfully. Also, according to the same source, the Russians managed to improve their positions on the line between the village of Piryutina and the village of Rovnopol. As for this direction, the Russians were attacking using two roads of attack. The first one, Piryutina-Rovnopol. Another road took place between the villages of Staromayorska and the village of Rovnopol itself. I'll remind you that just yesterday we got reports that the Russians managed to take under control the village of Makarovka. At least that was stated by different mappers like neutral, Russian, and some Russian sources. By taking under control the village of Makarovka, the Russians managed to secure their flanks, their eastern flank, and to secure possible roads of attack in the northern direction. I'll remind you that according to different military experts, the main target and the main purpose and the main task of the Russians in this direction is to reach as soon as possible the road 0510 by taking under control the villages like Novodarivka, Novopol, Zelene Polye, Novosilka, Rovnopol, and the village of Makarovka. If the Russians are able to take under control these territories, then the Russians will be able to cut physically the road 0510 that Ukrainians currently are using to rotate and to support forces and to connect the forces between the village of Velika Novoselovka and the village of Gulyai Polye. If the Russians can cut this road, then Ukrainians will suffer the significant problems on the territory of Velika Novoselka. Now let's discuss the situation that is currently taking place on the eastern flank of the Velika Novoselovka direction. We're talking about the line between Shakhtarska, Razdolne, and Velika Novoselovka itself. As for the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything, but most likely during the next 48 hours, the Russians will begin another offensive operation with the purpose to cut the road 0518 either from the northern direction or from the southern direction. If the Russians are able to cut this road, then this is going to be complete collapse for those Ukrainians that are currently located on the territory of the settlement, because they would be caught in cauldron without any chances for evacuation, for successful evacuation. Now let's move further and let's talk about the South Donetsk direction. During the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything from this area. The Russians, more precisely the group of forces were east since the beginning of the South Donetsk offensive operation, managed to complete every single task they have. They managed to reach as close as possible to the main supply roads that goes along the Mokry Yaly River and Sukhy Yaly River, and now they have already established complete FPV drone control. Just as a result of FPV drone attacks and artillery strikes, the Ukrainians every single day suffered significant losses. They're losing vehicles, manpower, and artillery systems, warehouse. The Russians are bombing everything that goes between the villages of Sukhy Yaly in the northwestern direction and the village of Yelizavetovka, just by attacks from the southern, from the villages of Maximovka and Bogoyavlenka. Now let's talk about the most important update from this area is Russian attack in the direction of the village by the name of Dalny. The Ukrainian sources reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Russians conducted very powerful offensive operation in the direction of the settlement using the significant number of armored vehicles, tanks, and personnel carriers, and as a result of clashes, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly, and just as a result of one attack, the Russians managed to take under control up to 60% of the settlement. We have the video that confirmed this. This video was published by the 33rd Mechanized Brigade, which is responsible for this direction. In this video we can see the significant number of Russian vehicles that were attacking Ukraine positions. Just take a look at this moment. Just in this episode we can calculate up to 20 vehicles that were regrouping before further advance in the western direction. Of course, the Ukrainians were trying to slow the Russians down. Several vehicles were destroyed and the Russians obviously suffered the losses. That attack wasn't like for free for the Russians, obviously, but for example in this part of the video we can see already the presence of the Russians on the territory of Dalny. So this is the first vehicle and this is the second vehicle that were already moving on the territory of the settlement, which confirms complete control or at least strong control over this part. The Ukrainians tried to counterattack, and to counterattack the Ukrainians sent the Leopard tank, which was working and operating in the northwestern part of the settlement, as the Ukrainian tank was attacking the Russians in the area of this barracks. Anyway, we don't know for sure about the exact status of the settlement because this video was published either yesterday in the evening, on the evening of the 11th of November, or in the early morning of the 12th of November. So I'm trying to tell you that since the video was published, we already more than 10 hours passed. So which means that the Russians during the previous 10 hours managed to improve their position significantly, most likely. And most likely tomorrow by the beginning of the 13th of November, most likely we're going to receive additional updates from this territory, which will allow us to adjust the map in Russian favor, maybe along this red line. If this information is correct and if we're going to receive this piece of news, most likely the Ukrainians that are currently located between the settlements like Uspenovka, Ganovka, Veselый Gай, Yelizavetovka and Ilinovka would caught at least into operational encirclement. In the worst scenario, the Ukrainians would be caught in cauldron. And most likely, if this information is correct, then most likely the Ukrainians during the next 2-3 days would be forced to fall back further in the northwestern direction, and this artillery pocket would be captured by the Russians. But based on experience and based on the things and events and news we've been receiving since the beginning of the special military operation, most likely the Ukrainian authorities and military authorities will sacrifice these Ukrainians in favor of common progress or common defense of the armed forces of Ukraine, just with the purpose to slow the Russians down as long as possible. Anyway, sooner or later we're gonna understand and see this, and obviously we can start counting even hours. Now let's move further. Let's talk about the city of Kurakhove itself. And since the beginning of this morning, we've been receiving lots of updates about the Russian progress on the ground. First, we were receiving different updates from different mappers, like Russian mappers that reported about control over the eastern part. Later, we got additional updates from neutral mappers about the same, that the Russians established at least control over the 50% of the eastern part of Kurakhove. And right before we start making the video, we got another let's say another video that was published by the 46th Air Mobile Brigade. This is something like 10 or 15 different episodes of how the forces and units of 46th Brigade of the Armored Forces Ukraine were trying to stop and to slow down the Russians. Around the city of Kurakhove, several vehicles were destroyed as a result of artillery strikes and FPV drone attacks. There are lots of episodes, as you can see, and one of the episodes was geolocated exactly in this point. The Ukrainians were bombing and attacking the Russians in this point along the Zaporizhzhia Ave. Based on this video, we have adjusted the northern part of the eastern Kurakhove in Russian favor, and currently we can make a conclusion that around 50% of the eastern Kurakhove is already under complete Russian control. The Ukrainians controls just the southern part of the eastern Kurakhove, also around 50%. Once again, all these updates we also received around 14 hours ago, so most likely during the previous day the Russians managed to improve their positions, and maybe the Russians have already secured the eastern part of the city completely, and maybe tomorrow the first Russian assault groups will begin offensive operation further in the central direction. Now let's move further and let's talk about this video. Today we got details, and today we got the video how the Ukrainians destroyed the dam, the Kurakhove dam, which was probably not the Ukrainians, maybe the Russians, very difficult to understand. Anyway, after this explosion, there was very big problems in the area because the water from Kurakhova Dam went in the western and the southwestern directions, and currently this area is flooded. There are very big problems for the Ukrainian supply and support, and obviously their support possibilities were reduced at least in several times. And this is a very critical situation during the Russian offensive operation in the central part of the city itself and Russian attempts to secure the village of Dalnya. If the Ukrainians are not able to restore their communications with the mainland, the situation can be finished. The situation with the entire South Donetsk direction can be finished much more faster than we were expecting. Now let's move further. Let's talk about the northern direction, the direction that's also where the Ukrainians also were caught, at least in operational encirclement. And as for this, based on the reports with the dam, the Ukrainians from the villages of Berestki and Ilinka lost their supply and support from the mainland, because according to different military experts, this is approximately the area of pollution. And as you can see, the main area of pollution goes exactly along the main supply roads that goes in the direction of Kurakhova and in the direction of this artillery pocket. Now the Ukrainians don't have any possibilities to supply themselves, so which means that most likely during the upcoming nights between the 12th and 13th of November, the Ukrainians will start retreat towards the village of Shevchenka. Once again, and we start receiving updates of this type, that according to information we have, the Ukrainian military authorities ordered to stay on these lines till the last soldier. But the thing is that Ukrainians began desertions, and currently there were already recorded a lot of cases of retreating from positions without receiving order from the Ukrainian military authorities. And obviously the principle of domino, nobody canceled these principles, and most likely during the next several days we may see the significant disaster of the entire direction for the armored forces of Ukraine. Now let's discuss additional updates from Novoselidovka. Today, according to information we have, the Russians managed to secure the village completely. As for the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, they haven't provided us this information, but probably tomorrow or the day after they will give us these updates. So this is how the map was changing between the 11th and the 12th of November. The Russians secured Novoselidovka, and the Russians managed to take under control around 60% of Dalnya, and the Russians captured already around 10 or 20% of Kurakhova itself. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Selidova direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. Different mappers reported that the Russians managed to improve their positions and to answer the village of Yurivka, to semi-encircle these 2 or 3 strongholds between the village of Zarya and Novoalexeyevka, and to improve their positions in the village of Petrikovka. Furthermore, the Russians continue FPV droning the Ukrainian forces in Ukrainian positions further along the railways, which confirms that the Russians are not planning to stop, and the Russians are planning to move further in the northwestern direction, with the purpose most likely to take under control everything along the railways and along the next red line. So as for all these geolocations and as for all these strikes, we can make a conclusion that in the very near future the Russians will try to take everything under control that is located inside of this red line. So everything here most likely would be captured by the Russians probably by the beginning of 2025 or in early January of 2025, which will increase the length of semi-encirclement of the city of Pokrovsk. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Toretsk agglomeration. During the previous 24 hours, we have small changes, adjustments on the ground in the central part based on the video that was published by the Ukrainian sources. In this video, we can see how Ukrainians were dropping bombs on the edge Russian positions. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map. We have colored the contested area into the territory under complete Russian control. As for the city of Chasiv Yar, we haven't received anything, but we start receiving very interesting updates from Slavyansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration. During the previous 24 hours, we received a significant number of geolocations of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions on the territory of the agglomeration. The Russians were using their new FAB 500. That can be that's the distance of this FAB. The range of the use of this FAB is already up to 120 kilometers. This is new technology of the Russian Federation, and as you can see, they began testing this technology on the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration. Just during the previous 24 hours, we got up to 6 or 7 events or different posts from different authors about different attacks in different places of this agglomeration. So which is very important, which means that the Russians are moving their focus further deep inside of the territory of Ukraine rear, which means another problems and another casualties, another disaster for the Ukrainian logistic. And once again, this is the first time since the beginning of the special military operation when we start receiving the videos of this type from this agglomeration. The Russians are getting very close. As for the southern Kupiansk direction, pro-Russian resources reported about additional progress on the ground. The Russians managed to improve their positions a little bit in the northern part of the village of Terny, and the Russians managed to advance a little bit along these forests. So the Russians are moving, and currently the Ukrainians trying to regroup in this direction with the purpose to stay as close as possible to the main evacuation roads, because when time comes, they want to be sure that they are able to evacuate as many as possible. As for the northern Kupiansk direction, during the previous 24 hours, we got several updates. One of them is coming from the village of Kolesnikovka. I'll remind you that just yesterday, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes, the Russians managed to secure the village of Kolesnikovka completely. And today, different mappers like Syriac reported that the Russians managed to take under control the railway station by the name of Kolesnikovka and the forest around. So we see additional progress on the ground, and as we discussed, the main target and the main tasks for the Russians at this stage is to secure the forest completely, which will allow them to get a very powerful and stronghold, a very powerful foothold before further advancing in the northern direction. And we have another video during the previous 24 hours of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions and the Ukrainian logistic roads. The sources are saying that as a result of FAB attack, another pontoon bridge was destroyed. Now we are moving to the Zaporizhzhia direction, where the Russians are on the fifth day of since the beginning of the Russian third counteroffensive, managed to break the situation, managed to take the initiative in their hands. We're not talking about full control and full initiative in the Russians, but now we can say that the ratio is something like 60 to 40 in Russian favor. The Russians are advancing, and we see additional changes on the ground. This is the situation by the end of the 11th of November. As you can see, the Russians by the end of the 11th of November managed to enter the northern part of Darina to improve their positions a little bit in Zelyony Shlях. But as for the beginning, as for the end of the 12th of November, the Russians managed to take completely the northern artillery pocket and the northwestern artillery pocket. We made these adjustments on map based on the videos that was published by the Russians. In this video, we can see the significant number of FPV drone and artillery strikes on Ukrainian forces that were located in the forest to the south of Kremennoye. Later, the Russians cleared this territory, and furthermore, we have another video of how the Russians were discovered and located exactly in this point. There are several Russian vehicles with Russian soldiers. Also, we have lots of videos of how the Ukrainians of the 95th Air Mobile Brigade were FPV droning and attacking the Russians exactly in this point. Based on this video, we have made adjustments in the northern part. Now we can compare the map between the two dates. This is the situation by the end of the 11th of November. This is the situation by the end of the 12th of November. The significant progress, and the Russians are continuing further, moving further in the southern direction. And as we discussed in the previous videos, most likely the current target for the Russians is to take everything until the river of Snagas. So this is the river of Snagas and Loknya, the river of Loknya, and the Russians are planning to take everything exactly along this line and to force the Ukrainians to fall back. If the Russians are able to do this, then the battle for Zaporizhzhia is going to begin. Furthermore, in the southeastern direction, the Russians managed to improve their positions and to take under control the strategical point between two rivers, which lead to complete destruction of Ukrainian logistic in the village of Plokhova. Most likely in the very near future, the Russians are going to begin assault operation towards this settlement as well, because now the Ukrainians in this direction were caught in cauldron They have just one option, just one way to evacuate in the western direction towards another bank of the river of Sol, towards the village of Guiva. And most likely this is exactly what is going to happen during the next 24-48 hours. Due to very high intensivity of clashes in the Sudzha direction, the Ukrainians are forced to bring as many as possible reinforcements and reserves to the border between Russia and Ukraine. They have concentrated a significant number of forces with the purpose to conduct rotations, supply and support, evacuation, many other things. The Russians can see everything, and starting off today, the Russians began bombing and attacking this territory with a significant number of Iskander missiles. For example, in this video we can see that the Russians managed to discover another temporary deployment point of FPV drone operators, and as a result of Iskander strike, that temporary deployment point was destroyed. Later, when Ukrainians were trying to carry out additional evacuation or to check what is happening, the consequences of this attack, the Russians began to bomb the same territory with the cluster, with the Iskanders, but with the cluster warhead. So we see that Ukrainians from one side can't bring additional forces on or reinforcements, and if they can do this, they always suffer the significant losses. Meanwhile, the forces of Ukrainian army in the Sudzha direction are fighting with the Russians and also suffering significant losses. So the battle is very difficult and the losses are very heavy for now from both sides. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.